Hello everyone, welcome to Comcare's webinar on psychosocial hazards and regulation. I'm Justin Napier, General Manager of Comcare's Regulatory Operations Group, and I'll be one of your hosts for today's event. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting virtually today. I'm joining you from Melbourne, so I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and of the Kulin Nations. I would like to pay my respect to their elders past and present and acknowledge the contribution they have made and continue to make. I also extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islander people present today. I also acknowledge the cultures of everyone here today and the richness that these cultures bring to the work that we do. Joining me today is Kellie Heran. Kellie is Comcare's Senior Director, National Program. So this session is being recorded. However, only myself, Kellie, and the slides will be captured in the recording. This recording will be made available on our website in the coming week. You will notice your microphone and camera are not able to be turned on. We do encourage you to participate in the conversation via the chat. However, we do ask that you keep it respectful and on topic. If you're using the Microsoft Teams app, there are instructions on the screen now on how to turn off chat notifications during this webinar. I'd like to thank you for making the time to come along to today's webinar. We recognise there is a lot of discussion around psychosocial hazards and regulation. So we've developed a session today covering off on a few of these areas. We appreciate the number of comments and questions left by you on this topic when registering. So again, thank you for that input. And the feedback has helped us shape today's session. We can't cover everything today, but we'll continue to address this important topic over the coming months. The session today will focus on the upcoming amendments to the regulations and what this means for you, Comcare's regulatory approach and the supports available, and there'll be an opportunity for you to share your insights and learn from what others are doing to enable mentally healthy workplaces. Before we begin, if you do find today's session to be distressing, we've posted some links and contact numbers to support services in the chat. So by way of background, the Model Work Health and Safety laws were developed by Safe Work Australia in 2011 as a nationally consistent framework to secure the health and safety of workers and workplaces. The model laws have been adopted by all Australian jurisdictions except in Victoria. Each state and territory has a work health and safety regulator who is responsible for monitoring and enforcing compliance with these laws. For those of you who work for a state or territory government, a local council or a private enterprise, it is most likely that you will be regulated by your state or territory work health and safety regulator. I urge you to visit the Safe Work Australia website where you'll find links to the WHS regulator in your jurisdiction. Now, Comcare is the regulator for the Commonwealth jurisdiction. This includes all federal government agencies as well as some national companies who are licensed to self-insure under the Commonwealth scheme. So to be clear, today we're talking about amendments to the Commonwealth Work Health and Safety regulations, and these only apply to those in the Comcare jurisdiction. We will post a link in the chat now to a list of licensees within the Comcare scheme, as well as to Safe Work Australia's webpage. So in 2018, Safe Work Australia commissioned a review of the Model Work Health and Safety laws to examine whether they were operating as intended. This review is commonly known as the Boland Review. Now, while the final report of the review found that the Model WHS laws were largely operating as intended, the report did make 34 recommendations to improve clarity and consistency. Among the key recommendations was one, to amend WHS regulations to deal with how to identify the psychosocial risks associated with psychological injury and the Commonwealth WHS regulations that implement this recommendation will come into effect on the 1st of April this year. The WHS Act uses the term persons conducting a business or undertaking, commonly known as PCBUs. However, today, Kellie and I will be using the term employers to mean the same thing. So the regulations prescribe how PCBUs or employers must identify and manage psychological hazards that may create risks to workers' psychosocial health and safety. Now, this isn't new territory. The WHS Act already defines health to include psychological health. Employers must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, that workers and other persons are not exposed to risks to their psychological or physical health and safety. The Commonwealth Department of Employment and Workplace Relations is working closely with Comcare to ensure appropriate information and guidance is available to support employers and workers to understand and meet their obligations for managing psychological risks. And Safe Work Australia has published the Model Code of Practice, Managing Psychosocial Hazards at Work, on their website. The Commonwealth Code of Practice is under consideration, but in the meantime, the Safe Work Australia Model Code can assist you to identify and manage psychosocial hazards in your workplaces. So hopefully that's provided you with some background and context for today's webinar. I'll now hand over to Kellie to talk about the amendments in more details. Welcome, Kellie.
Thanks, Justin, and hello, everyone. I'm Kellie Heran, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Yugambeh people, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. As Justin mentioned, there are many questions for us to cover today. I hope the webinar will address some of these and point you in the direction of next steps to take to achieve compliance with your respective WHS duties and to prepare for the forthcoming regulation amendments. On the 15th of December 2022, the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations passed amendments relating to psychosocial hazards, and as Justin said, these regulations come into effect on the 1st of April. There are many questions that centred around psychosocial hazards. What are they? How are they defined? And how do you identify them? These amendments to the WHS regulations set out in Regulation 55A state that psychosocial hazards are defined as those hazards that arise from or relate to the design or management of work, or the work environment, or plant at a workplace, or workplace interactions or behaviours, and may cause physical harm, psychological harm, whether or not it may also cause physical harm. The amendment also now clearly defines psychosocial risk in Regulation 55B as a risk to the health and safety of a worker or another person, arising from a psychosocial hazard. This is consistent with the definition of a health in the Work Health and Safety Act, meaning both physical and psychological health. The key to managing psychosocial risks is to apply the risk management process, just as you would for any other hazard, to a standard of so far as is reasonably practical. The amendment to the regulations state that they must be managed in accordance with Part 3.1 of the regulations, which is to identify reasonably foreseeable hazards that give rise to the risk of psychosocial risk, eliminate risks, and if not reasonably practical, minimise them, maintain effective control measures, and review and revise where necessary. At each step of the risk management process, consultation with workers who are or are likely to be directly affected by a work health and safety matter and any HSR must be undertaken. For example, consultation should occur on proposed changes that affect work health and safety, such as policies, procedures, and systems of work, changes to staffing levels, new reporting, and working arrangements, just to name a few. At the core of managing risk is having and demonstrating genuine management commitment. This can be built by ensuring leaders understand their duties under WHS laws, the risk management process, the benefits of or the business case for effectively managing psychosocial hazards, and the roles of various organisational leaders, such as human resources and WHS managers. There are also due diligence duties with respect to the health and safety of officers, of employers. Leaders need to be proactive about safety in their workplace and act promptly on warning signs of illness, injury, and risk. On the screen now are the common psychosocial hazards listed in the Model Code of Practice that Justin referred to earlier. It is important to note that this list is not exhaustive. Workers and others in the workplace are likely to be exposed to a combination of psychosocial hazards. Some risks may be constantly present, while others may rise sporadically. There are a number of ways that psychosocial hazards can be identified in the workplace, including consulting your workers and their HSRs, using surveys and tools, observing work and behaviours, reviewing information available, looking for trends, and having a reporting mechanism and encouraging reporting in your workplace. The model code, accessible on the Safe Work Australia website, defines the individual hazards in more detail. This will assist you in being able to identify these hazards, and I would recommend that you take a look at this guidance. Before I move on, I'll draw your attention to a few of these hazards, those being job demands and bullying and harassment, including sexual harassment. These hazards are called out in Comcare's prevention strategy as hazards where the prevalence of harm is persistent or increasing across the Comcare jurisdiction. Bullying and harassment, for example, accounted for 1/3 of all accepted claims related to mental stress in 2020-21. Work demands or pressures, on the other hand, are the second highest driver of mental stress claims in the Comcare scheme for the last 10 years, and these are trending upwards. So even though I've called out those two hazards, there may be other priority hazards in your workplace. So once you've identified psychosocial hazards in your workplace, the next step is to assess the risk they create. This will help you determine what is reasonably practical in managing the risks. To assess the risk of harm, you need to identify workers affected and consider the duration, that is, how long is the worker exposed to the hazard or risk, the frequency, how often is the worker exposed to the hazard or risk, and the severity, so how severe are the hazards and the worker's exposures. The risk register template at Appendix C in the model code may assist you to capture this information. These hazards also need to be considered collectively rather than in isolation. Workers and others may be exposed to more than one psychosocial hazard at any time, and hazards can interact or combine. An example could be a job that includes periods of high and low job demands, and at the same time, it may also involve a combination of low or high mental, emotional, or physical demands. Assessing risk collectively may help you to identify and implement more effective control measures by adding layers of defence or protection with a more holistic approach. Psychosocial risks can cause both physical and psychological injuries. The severity of psychological injuries varies, but in comparison to physical injuries, on average, they require longer off work and are more costly. There are tools available to help you with the risk management process, including the People at Work tool, which is a free evidence-based survey tool with a range of resources, and the PSC 12, or Psychosocial Climate tool, that measures the safety climate and lead indicators within your organisation through the Healthy Workplace Audit tool. And we'll add the links to those tools in the chat now. Another question we were asked was, what risks do we focus our effort on? This will be different to each organisation. However, when assessing risk, it is crucial to focus the most effort on psychosocial hazards that are severe or can impact large numbers of workers or workers. It is also important to focus on things that have a very high risk of harm, but maybe for a smaller group of people. We also received many questions on how to determine effective control measures. What is better practice, and what do we need to consider? Once you know which psychosocial hazards are present and you have assessed the risks they create, you're now in a position to control them. Every workplace is different. The combination of control measures will be tailored to your employer's size, type, and work activities to manage risks during both everyday operation and in emergencies. To determine what is reasonably practical to manage psychosocial risks, identify as many control measures as you can, consider which of these control measures are most effective, and consider which controls are reasonably practical in the circumstances. The amendment to the regulation outlined in Regulation 55D says that regard should be had to a range of relevant factors, including, as I mentioned before, the duration, frequency, and severity of exposure, how hazards and risks interact and combine, the design and systems of work, including job demands, the design, layout, and environmental conditions of the workplace, and ensuring that information, training, instruction and supervision is provided to workers. While the Commonwealth WHS regulations largely mirror the model regulations, employers in the Comcare jurisdiction will need to use the hierarchy of controls to manage psychosocial hazards. So I'll now pass back over to Justin to discuss the application of the hierarchy of controls.
Yeah, thanks, Kellie. The amendment to the regulations clarifies that employers will need to use the hierarchy of controls in the same way that they are using the hierarchy to manage physical hazards currently. And this is outlined in Regulation 36. This is a fundamental aspect or element of risk management, and the hierarchy must be applied to both physical and psychosocial hazards and risks at work. We understand that through the risk assessment process, some employers may not always consider it reasonably practicable to eliminate the particular hazards or risks. An example of this is where the jobs have inherent hazards. For example, work might need to be performed in remote or isolated locations, and this will result in a risk for workers. In these circumstances, the hierarchy of controls requires duty holders to minimise risks by one or more of the following lower order controls. These could include substituting wholly or partly the work practice, or replacing a hazard or hazardous work practice with something that gives rise to a lesser risk through, for instance, changing the design of the work or the system of work. You could also isolate or separate the hazard or hazardous work practice from any person who's exposed to it. An example here could be placing barriers between workers and customers, or enclosing machinery to isolate workers from unpleasant or hazardous noises. We know that environmental conditions can be both a physical and psychosocial hazard. Or you might be able to implement an engineering control, such as a physical control measure. For example, you could secure objects such as chairs that could be picked up and thrown in a customer service environment, or you could install duress alarms. If the risk remains after applying the substitution, isolation, or engineering measures, employers must minimise the remaining risk. This would involve implementing administrative controls, such as organisational policies and standard operating procedures, as well as providing information, training and instruction. However, administrative controls are less reliable at minimising risk because they rely on human behaviour and should only be used in conjunction with higher order controls. To be effective, multiple lower order controls may need to be used in combination. For example, it is one thing to have a bullying and harassment policy, but without appropriate communication, training, management, leadership, and processes for monitoring and reporting, it is unlikely to be effective. The Model Code of Practice provides examples on the control measures that can be implemented to respond to common hazards in workplaces. Some of the common approaches include good work design, which considers hazards and risks as early as possible in the planning and design process of work. When redesigning work, you should consider how work is performed. Look at the task duration, the frequency, the complexity of the work, the context of the systems and work, and any plant or equipment or facilities, and the physical, emotional, and mental capacity of the workers. Another approach is to provide workers with information, training, instruction, and supervision. Or you might implement safe systems of work, such as organisational rules, policies, procedures, and work practices. And you could make reasonable adjustments for individual workers, such as those returning to work after a work-related injury or illness to prevent further harm to their health. Your risk management process must identify all reasonably foreseeable risks for these workers and ensure that risk controls take these workers' needs into account. The Model Code of Practice outlines this further. You should also consider the guidance and information that is available. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Look at the material that is publicly available and then apply this to the identified risks in your workplace. And lastly, once controls have been implemented, you must review the effectiveness of the controls to ensure that they're working as you'd planned. A review of control measures is required in circumstances such as where a new hazard or risk is identified, where the control measures are not eliminating or minimising the risks effectively, or where a change in the workplace is planned that may give rise to a new or different health and safety risk, and the current control measures are not effective, or where the results of consultation with workers indicates a review is necessary, or if an HSR requests a review because they reasonably believe one of the risks or their controls has changed and needs further review. Common review methods include things like inspecting the workplace, consulting with workers and their representatives, analysing any records or data that you might have, and this is similar to what we've mentioned in the risk identification process. I'd also urge you to record the risk management process undertaken and its outcomes. This includes details of any consultation undertaken with workers, HSRs and other duty holders, the hazards that have been identified, how the risks were assessed, any control measures implemented, and importantly, any training that's been provided. So we've now reviewed the risk management process and we've discussed the amendments to the regulations. Kellie, can you tell us what employers should be doing next?
Thanks, Justin. We do hear that people are concerned or find the management of psychosocial risks difficult and challenging. It ought not to be. By applying the risk management framework, it is possible to go through this process methodically. You need to be educating yourself in relation to psychosocial hazards and risks and consider which of these apply in your workplace. The work health and safety systems and risk assessments need to include identification of psychosocial hazards if they don't already. This will assist the employer to comply with its duties under the WHS Act. Senior leadership inside your organisation need to be aware of the duty to manage psychosocial risks. They need to understand the need to manage those risks and be actively involved in monitoring implementation of controls. In saying that, this is a timely opportunity to have discussions across the organisation, across work groups, with HSRs and with health and safety committees. At each step of the risk management process, continue to consult with workers and don't forget to include your contractors and labour hire workers. Now is also the time to review the mental health programs, supports and policies currently available in your workplace and consider if they are evidence-based, are tied to the hazards identified in the process, and are not just off-the-shelf packages. Earlier in the session, we mentioned that there are some support services available. Make sure workers know where they can go for help and support, and make sure those are available and accessible. These can include external support services like Beyond Blue and Black Dog Institute, workplace supports like employee assistance programs, new access workplaces, and early intervention programs. Internal supports like HSRs, mental health first aiders, harassment contact officers, as well as being aware of internal processes around reporting incidents, dispute resolution processes, knowing how to contact HSRs and health and safety committees. One of the commonly asked questions we received is, when do we notify of a psychosocial incident and what needs to be notified to the regulator? This question relates to another key recommendation from the Boland Review, which was to include a notification trigger to the incident notification provisions for psychological injury and illness. Please take note, at this stage, there are no changes to the incident notification requirements. We anticipate that a regulation impact analysis will be prepared and released by Safe Work Australia for public consultation during 2023. We strongly encourage you to participate in the consultation process to better understand the impacts on your organisation and to use this opportunity to provide feedback. Another question we've been asked is, how is Comcare going to regulate compliance with the duties regarding psychosocial risks? As mentioned earlier, Comcare already expects duty holders to comply with duties regarding physical and psychological health and safety in the workplace. And we will continue to apply the compliance enforcement policy to psychosocial hazards as we do for physical hazards. Comcare is here to assist and support the jurisdiction, and we have a dedicated unit within our inspectorate to focus on the regulation of psychosocial hazards and associated risks. Currently, the team is engaging with the jurisdiction with the aim of determining the maturity of organisations to manage psychosocial hazards and risks, and they're developing an evidence base for future inspectorate activities, including guidance material for the jurisdiction to support compliance. Central to this important work is a proactive inspection program that's being trialled across 3 scheme employers. Consistent with our compliance enforcement policy, we are taking a supportive and collaborative approach to achieving compliance across the jurisdiction. We'll preference the use of voluntary compliance tools, like providing targeted information advice and reaching agreements with regulated entities to achieve specific improvements. However, where serious risks or contraventions are identified, Comcare will take enforcement action as necessary. So Justin, can you please summarise what Comcare expects from employers?
Sure, and thanks, Kelly. I'll try to summarise what we've covered today. So the steps are simple. Firstly, you do need to take a proactive approach with this, meaning you will need to actively look for risks and hazards that apply in your workplaces and manage them before they result in harm. As a WHS regulator, Comcare expects employers to apply a systems-based approach to the management of hazards and risks in workplaces. As we've said a number of times today, consultation and engagement with workers is absolutely critical. Without engaging your workers, there is no way to truly understand how these hazards, risks, and controls play out in the unique circumstances of your workplaces. When Comcare inspectors visit, we will want to see evidence that genuine consultation is taking place. Senior managers also need to understand their duties and obligations. They will need to buy into this and support this work. As mentioned earlier, there are due diligence obligations for officers, so they will need to take an active role as organisational leaders. It's about walking the walk and demonstrating commitment to health and safety, not just talk the talk. We expect you to be actively monitoring the regulatory landscape, and we are pleased to see so many of you here today demonstrating your commitment and engagement to this work. So look out for new guidance as it becomes available, codes of practice and other helpful information. As Kelly said before, if employers do fail to fulfil their duties, we will take regulatory action in line with Comcare's compliance and enforcement policy. But our first position as a regulator is that we are here to support you. As we've said, we will continue to release more guidance and supports. Our website is home to a catalogue of information, including guidance on workplace sexual harassment, and more recently, new guidance relating to work demands, which is specifically targeted at workers, managers and supervisors. We also offer training courses and e-learns on our learning management system. And next Monday, the 3rd of April, we will be hosting the next Mental Health Community of Practice. And we'll add a link to that in the chat so you can register for that event. So to wrap up the session, we'd like to run a short Mentimeter activity. So this is optional and anonymous. It's the fun part of the event. You can join us by scanning the QR code on the screen or going to mentimeter.com and entering the code which is on the screen there, 55420772. We encourage you to participate, to be part of the conversation, and hopefully you'll gain some insights from what others are doing and provide some feedback to Comcare on future supports and further work that we might undertake to assist you with this process of managing psychosocial risk. So let's go to the Mentimeter activity. And the first question that's there is, what are the hazards that are prevalent in your workplace? So as you enter your responses, there you go, they're coming up on the screen. So this question relates to what's keeping you up at night, what's worrying you about these changes. You can choose more than one hazard. There's 14 in the SWA code. They're listed on the screen too. And this will be good information for us to know what support and guidance we might be able to provide you as the regulator in this space. Kelly's going to help me ad-lib as we monitor the responses coming through. So number one so far, Kel, was job demands. I don't think we're surprised to see that. That's pretty common, I think, in terms of inquiries that we've had.
No, and continue to be very well supported by the audience. Poor organisational change management. It's another thing we've been looking at over the last couple of years, and we'll continue to develop more supports for the jurisdiction. Another one that stands out to me is remote and isolated work at number 5. Again, something that we are looking at developing more guidance material on.
And pleasingly, I guess, that there's relatively low numbers that are referencing harassment, including sexual harassment, as a hazard prevalent in workplaces. So that's good. Bullying's pretty low too. Violence and aggression. There's some of the hazards that tend to manifest in the worst outcomes, of course. So it's good that numbers are quite low. Low job control is another one that's interesting. And I see a question's popped up. What do colours mean? I've got no idea what the colours mean.
I think that's just a colour scheme that's been chosen.
Okay, so it looks like things have sort of stopped moving around on that one. So let's go to our next question, which is, what do you see as the main barriers or challenges to managing psychosocial hazards? It's a good point about sexual harassment. There's some good comments coming through. If we've got time towards the end, we might have a look at a couple of those, see how we go. So this is just a list that will generate. They don't group, unfortunately, these. So we'll just keep a watch on some of those challenges that you've identified that you or your organisation is facing. So what we want to know, what are some of the constraints or barriers that you're having to navigate in this space? And it will be interesting to see if we're facing similar type barriers or whether there's patterns and trends emerging or whether there's a lot of variation here.
So Justin, one of the things I've picked out from the first few that have come through is lack of leadership or management in the space. Is there a bit around capability?
Knowledge, training, understanding. There's a few comments around that.
Culture, absolutely.
So hopefully you know where to find a lot of that information and a lot of that knowledge. I think it's fair to say it's a growing sort of body of knowledge over time, and Comcare, Safe Work Australia, the state and territory regulators and a whole range of other organisations doing work in this space and adding to that body of knowledge. We'll endeavour to group that up through the Comcare website and to assist you to undertake that, that assessment. Things are moving around pretty quickly. Stigma was one I noted there, Kel.
Human behaviour.
Employees feeling they can share problems is a good one. I mean, we've talked a lot about the really critical importance of consultation with workers and engagement. Really, you know, that's a cultural piece as well, and you really want your organisation to be putting safety, health and safety front and centre, and having that willingness to talk about how the work practices might contribute negatively or ideally positively to health and safety. And that dialogue's really critical. Management and leadership, again, has got a few of those there. Australian culture of mateship, failure to call out unacceptable behaviours. I mean, this is workplace culture again, and hopefully these changes to the law and growing awareness of the impact of psychosocial illness and injury in workplaces will start to shift that thinking. You know, we've been through some tough years with COVID, and I think my sense is at least that awareness of psychosocial impact of work is higher than it's ever been, and hopefully that's starting to change behaviours and culture and thinking in that space.
There's also been a bit of a theme through the responses around, you know, the exposure to trauma. that's evident in the roles that people undertake as well.
Yeah.
So I think that one stopped moving forward.
Leadership and bias. I wonder what that means. The bias is up again. The barriers. Someone wants to add some comments, perhaps in the chat, about what they mean by bias. I'm interested to understand some of that thinking. Remote working is another one. I mean, we have workplaces have changed, perhaps forever. Hybrid work, remote work is something that we're going to have to, adapt to and manage the risks that are associated with that. And that no doubt requires commitment and leadership and empathy and an understanding of and adaptation. How do you apply this to services? Sorry, the chat's gone. We'll come back to that. Unconscious bias, decoding, exposing the unseen bias. Some fantastic commentary in the chat, can I say? Thank you for those who are putting that there. I suspect we've got more webinars down the track as we unpack some of this and work with the jurisdiction to assist you to comply with your duties in this space. Personal accountability, lack of understanding, enormous number of responses. This is fantastic stuff. Bit hard to follow the chat and the screen too, so if I'm missing things, I apologies. Lack of root cause analysis, why it occurs.
So Justin, just while we're flicking across to the next question and people start to answer that one, we did have a question in the chat earlier about, is the employer also responsible for the psychosocial safety of subcontractors? Yes. Under the WHS laws, a person is a worker if the person carries out work in any capacity for a PCBU or employer, including working as an employee, a contractor, subcontractors, or their employees, a labour hire worker or an out worker, apprentice or trainee, or it can be a work experience student or a volunteer. So the Act does cover off on a lot of people working in the workplace. So if you do have people that are coming into your workplace and undertaking work, then yes, you are required to look after their psychosocial safety as well.
We've moved to the next question, Cal. Do you have a good example of how your organisation's managing psychosocial hazards? And many people have already jumped to that. And I see a lot of no's, Kelly. Let's hope when we look at this again in 6 months' time, there's pages and pages of really positive things. I mean, sure, look, we're interested to understand if there are programs or any tools or supports that you put in place, any interventions, education, guidance, checklists, anything of that nature. So there's a few coming through there. Risk assessments, risk frameworks are there, lodging of psychosocial incidents as incident reports.
Yeah, and I think that one's a particularly a good example because it allows the organisation to have written documentation about an incident that's occurred and then obviously follow up on that internally to hope implement control measures to prevent future occurrence.
If anyone's got examples of their leadership taking, a positive position on this, that would be interested to hear about that. Someone's allowed to attend the presentation, so that's a good thing. Thank you for that feedback. Some people have got, one organisation's got a dedicated team, a psychosocial risk register. As we've said in the presentation, you really do need to be asking yourself the question as to whether those known psychosocial risks are evident in your workplaces, and you need to be then looking at what you might be able to do through a range of measures. We've mentioned some of them in the presentation to address that and to mitigate and control that risk. Provided an accidental counsellor training by Lifeline. There are a range of support services that are available, not just the regulator, but a whole range of others and Beyond Blue and supports that you could put in place as well to assist those who might have early signs of some sort of psychosocial injury. They're really important measures as well. Mental health first aid officers is a really good one.
So there's one in the chat as well, which is our workplace has just released a survey which addresses all sorts of factors which could contribute, including eating habits, exercise habits, alcohol, coffee intake, sleep, and all sorts of impact they're trying to get a snapshot of the current state of the workforce, which the person thinks is a step in the right direction.
Really good feedback. Okay, so there's 290, nearly 300 answers in that on that screen. A whole lot of wonderful things. So we started with a lot of no's, Kel, but people have been thinking about it.
We got there at the end.
And they've realised, yes, we're actually doing some really positive things in this space. So that's really good, because I was incredibly worried at the start when the no's started coming in. Okay, let's go to our last question then, which is what can Comcare do to support you to manage psychosocial hazards with more confidence? So if there are particular forums that you're interested in hearing about, something that you'd like us to test today, something that you think is a particular gap in your understanding, an area where you really want to learn more, are there experts that Comcare can put you in touch with, for instance? So this is your chance to help us set the agenda going forward in terms of the future work. So resources in one place, more events like today, that's great to hear. Pragmatic advice and examples of risk management. Look, I think that's really important. I think there's a fear factor around how PCBUs, employers, respond to these particular hazards. And I think it ought not be difficult. And I think one of the things that we want to do is start to provide some examples of positive risk assessment and some practical measures that can be employed. And you know, the previous question, there's a whole range of things there that people are doing. Hopefully you're learning from that, and you'll be in a position to start applying that in your workplaces. All right, Cal. Seminars, education, more guidance. I mentioned the Comcare learning management system, so there is a whole range of product out there. We are developing material on a regular basis and producing it. Train SES in people management, change management. I think change management and capability in that space is something that many organisations perhaps are struggling with. Workplace visits and inspections. It's not often we get encouraged to undertake more workplace visits and inspections, but yeah, we are doing work in that space. And I think, Kellie, you mentioned that we've got a dedicated psychosocial team within the inspectorate that is engaging. We've got a pilot underway, and we plan to roll that out more broadly later in the year. So we will be engaging with the jurisdiction and checking in on what you're doing in this space.
Justin, I'm not sure if you covered off on it, but there's a good theme through here around training for supervisors and workers. So Comcare does have some e-learn available on our website if you would like to take a look at that, but we're continually developing future e-learn. So if you've got any suggestions on what you'd like to see in that space, then please let us know in the feedback form that you'll fill in hopefully later.
Yeah, thank you. Now, sorry, you go.
Oh, no, I just got another question. So we had a question in the chat a little bit earlier, just while we wait for the last few to come through. There's a question around, is uncertainty as a mental stressor considered under poor change management? So poor change management is an identified psychosocial hazards, and we do have more information and resources on this and the other 13 psychosocial hazards listed in the model code practice available on our website. So yes, and just take a look at that information that is available to, you know, delve into that a little bit more.
Okay, so well, we're nearly. Sorry, you go.
No, I was just gonna wrap up. Just worth noting that there have been a number of questions that have come through the chat today, which is fantastic, and throughout the registration process. So while we did try to cover off on as many as we could, we haven't been able to address them all. So we will use the questions that we received in both instances to develop further communications, Q&As, and to design future engagement opportunities. So what you've asked us and what you've provided is certainly not wasted, and we will try and use that as best we can into future communications. So thank you.
Thanks, Cal. So a couple of slides to finish. So stick with us, folks. We're nearly at time. So let's start with a couple of plugs, if you don't mind. So first one, nominations are now open for the Comcare National Safety Awards. Nominations need to be in by the 30th of April. And categories and more information can be found on our website, and there's a link in the chat now. So great chance to showcase really positive work you're doing to manage health and safety risks in your organisations. Next, we really appreciate you taking the time to complete a short survey. We'll email that out to you. It's also available by scanning the QR code on screen, and there is a link in the chat. If you have particular areas you'd like us to focus on for future events, please let us know. Topics you want more information on, experts you want to hear from. And there will be more information available in the coming months to assist you to effectively manage psychosocial risks in your workplaces. You can stay up to date with work that Comcare is doing by subscribing to our e-news, following us on LinkedIn or Twitter. And in closing, I just want to make the point that the management of psychosocial risks is incredibly important. We know that all work-related psychological injuries and illness have a significant negative impact on workers, their families and businesses. We know that on average, work-related psychosocial injuries have longer recovery times, higher costs, and require more time away from work when compared with physical injuries. And we also know that workers' compensation claims for psychological injury and illness have increased. And this is imposing higher costs to employers through premiums and loss of productivity. By managing psychosocial risks, we can protect workers, decrease staff turnover and absenteeism, and may improve broader organisational performance and productivity. So with that, thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you very much for your engagement and involvement with Mentimeter. Please stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you at our next event.